The courtroom was suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. Marcus Reed stood alone at the defendant's table, his hands folded tightly together. His suit was old but clean, his tie slightly crooked. He had come to prove his innocence, but as Judge Carol Whitmore leaned forward from her high bench, something colder than justice filled the air. "You people are always finding yourselves in my courtroom," she sneered, her voice slicing through the silence like shattered glass. "Maybe if you learned how to behave like the rest of us, you'd stay out of trouble." The words didn't echo. They stabbed. No one moved. Not the clerk. Not the bailiff. Not the 12 jurors who suddenly found great interest in the floor. Marcus looked up slowly, his eyes meeting hers. He wanted to speak, to defend not just himself, but every man who looked like him. Every man who had heard those words whispered behind closed doors. But here, in this place, spoken out loud by a woman sworn to uphold the law, it felt like betrayal itself. The silence broke when a camera flashed. Marcus hadn't noticed the reporter in the back row. Neither had Judge Whitmore. 5 minutes. That was all it took. 5 minutes for the video to reach 1,000 screens. 5 minutes for outrage to pulse through the courthouse like electricity. 5 minutes for the door at the back of the room to swing open and 2 federal marshals to step inside. Judge Carol Whitmore, one of them said, his voice firm and clear, "You are under arrest for violation of federal anti-discrimination laws and abuse of judicial power. Please step down." Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge, once towering in her seat, now seemed impossibly small. For the first time in her career, the gavel was no longer in her hand. Metal cuffs replaced the authority she had worn like armor. As they led her away, Marcus stood. Not to gloat. Not to jeer. But because he needed to remember this feeling, the moment justice didn't just speak. It roared. The same silence returned, but now it felt different. Like the end of a storm. And when Marcus walked out of that courtroom, free and vindicated, the weight of generations felt just a little bit lighter. Outside the courthouse, the world had changed. Reporters swarmed the steps like hornets, microphones stretched out toward Marcus as if his words alone could heal a wound centuries deep. But Marcus didn't stop to speak. Not yet. His heart was still pounding, his mind replaying every moment, every word the judge had thrown at him like stones. He thought of his father, who had warned him that no matter how well you dressed, no matter how polite you were, some people would only ever see the color of your skin. But today, the world had seen her. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, an older man waited for him. Mr. Langston. Marcus hadn't seen him since his first job interview out of college. Langston had been passed over for promotion year after year, his talent buried under the same quiet, polite racism that had once tried to swallow Marcus whole. "I watched the whole thing," Langston said softly. His voice cracked like old leather. "You didn't bow your head. I'm proud of you." Marcus swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "I shouldn't have had to fight like that." "I know." A siren wailed in the distance. Somewhere behind them, Judge Whitmore was being processed like any other criminal. Fingerprinted. Mugshot taken. The same steel doors that had slammed shut behind so many men like Marcus would now close behind her. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something almost like hope. Maybe justice wasn't perfect. Maybe it was late, so terribly, painfully late, but today it had shown up. And that meant tomorrow, it could show up again. By the time Marcus finally faced the crowd of reporters, the sun was beginning to set, streaking the sky in gold and crimson. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces, cameras blinking like unblinking eyes, and took a deep breath. I came here today expecting to prove my innocence, he said, his voice steady, carrying over the crowd. But it turns out the real criminal was wearing the robe. And if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. The crowd murmured. Somewhere, someone clapped. It grew louder, rippling outward. Marcus smiled, not because it was over, but because, maybe for the first time, it was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself standing in front of the same courthouse. But this time, he wasn't the defendant. He wasn't even a spectator. He was the voice. What started as one video had become a movement. People who had never met him were now gathering with signs, with chants, with stories of their own. Stories of judges who looked the other way. Employers who heard their names and made up reasons not to call back. Teachers who punished them harder for the same mistakes. Marcus never wanted fame. He had only wanted peace, a fair trial, the quiet dignity of walking out the same way he walked in. But now that the world was listening, how could he stay quiet? A reporter thrust a microphone toward him. Marcus, do you think Judge Whitmore's arrest is enough? Marcus looked out at the crowd. People of every color stood shoulder to shoulder. Some wore shirts with his name on them. Others held signs that read, "We believe Marcus and justice doesn't wear a robe." He shook his head slowly. One arrest doesn't fix a system built on silence. It doesn't erase what people like me live through every single day. But it's a start. The crowd cheered. But now, Marcus continued, we keep going. We shine a light on every courtroom. Every office. Every school. Because when people in power abuse it, we don't whisper. We don't look away. We hold them accountable. Together. From the front row, Mr. Langston gave him a proud nod. Marcus felt the weight of history on his shoulders, but this time it felt less like a burden and more like armor. Judge Whitmore's trial was set for the following month. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, she would stand before a judge, just as Marcus had. But no robe would save her now. And Marcus? He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And this time, the whole world was watching. The day of Judge Whitmore's trial felt unreal. Marcus sat quietly in the gallery, watching as the woman who once looked down on him from the bench now sat at the defendant's table, her eyes hollow, her once perfect hair trembling with every breath. The irony wasn't satisfying. Not really. Marcus thought it would be. He thought revenge might taste sweet. But as he looked at her, all he felt was pity. Because her downfall wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. During a recess, Marcus stepped into the hallway, where news crews waited like wolves. But today, he didn't dodge the cameras. I want people to understand something, he said, his voice calm, his hands folded in front of him. This is not just about one racist judge. It's about every system that allowed her to sit in that chair for years, making decisions that ruined people's lives while no one dared to challenge her. He looked straight into the lens. So we're going to fix that. And he meant it. By the time the trial ended and Whitmore was found guilty, Marcus had already been in contact with civil rights lawyers. Together, they launched the Second Gavel Project, an organization dedicated to reviewing past cases presided over by judges with discrimination complaints. Cases like his. Cases that never got the attention they deserved. Within months, the Second Gavel uncovered patterns of injustice that shook the state. Wrongful convictions. Excessive sentences. Bias so obvious, it was a miracle no one had acted sooner. And now, they were reopening cases. Now, people were getting second chances. One night, months later, Marcus stood in his small apartment, looking at the framed photo of his father. "If you see a door locked, son," his father had once said, "you don't just knock. You find the key, or you break it down." Marcus smiled. The key wasn't revenge. It wasn't even Whitmore's arrest. It was what came after. The rebuilding. The fighting. The light shining into places no one wanted to look. And for the first time in his life, Marcus didn't feel like a man surviving the system. He felt like a man changing it. And he was just getting started. 10 years later. The auditorium was filled with over 1,000 people. Students. Lawyers. Judges. Activists. Faces from every background, every generation. Marcus stood backstage, adjusting the lapel of his suit as the announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Please welcome the founder of the Second Gavel Project, and this year's recipient of the Justice Trailblazer Award, Marcus Reed." The applause was thunderous. Marcus walked to the podium, pausing for a moment to take it all in. The journey. The pain. The victories. The faces in the crowd who had once been voiceless and invisible but now sat front row, proud and unafraid. As the room quieted, Marcus cleared his throat. "When I first walked into a courtroom, I wasn't there to make history," he began. "I wasn't there to lead a movement. I was just a man trying to defend himself." He paused, scanning the crowd. But the truth is, injustice doesn't knock before it enters your life. It just takes. And if you let it, it'll take everything. He glanced down at his notes but decided he didn't need them. You all know what happened to Judge Whitmore. You know what happened after. But what matters most is what's still happening. Every single day, people are still standing up. Still fighting. Still demanding better. And that is how we win. The crowd erupted in cheers. Marcus continued, his voice full of conviction. Justice isn't a moment. It's a movement. And no matter how heavy the fight feels, no matter how long it takes, we have a duty to keep going. Because somewhere out there is another young man, standing in a courtroom alone, wondering if anyone will speak up for him. He looked up at the balcony, where his wife sat holding their newborn daughter. "I want my little girl to grow up in a world where fairness isn't just promised, it's practiced. Where the law protects everyone, not just a select few. And we're not there yet. But together, we're getting closer." The standing ovation felt endless. And as Marcus stepped off the stage, dozens of young law students rushed to meet him. They wanted to shake his hand, take photos, tell him how his fight had inspired their own. And as he looked at them, all hungry for change, ready to push the next door open, Marcus knew something deep in his bones. The gavel had fallen on Whitmore, yes. But the echo of that sound? It was still ringing. And now, it was ringing for everyone. 1 year later. Marcus sat in a small conference room in Geneva, Switzerland, staring at the name placard in front of him. Marcus Reed, founder, the Second Gavel Project. The United Nations had invited him to speak. What started as a single racist insult in a courtroom had turned into something international. Countries from all over the world wanted to know how the Second Gavel had exposed bias in the justice system. Some wanted help creating their own versions. Before the speech, Marcus checked his phone. There was a text from Mr. Langston back home. "Proud of you, son. Keep shining." And beneath it, a photo. The courthouse where it all began was getting renamed. The Marcus Reed Justice Center. Marcus stared at the image for a long time. How do you process something like that? How does a man who was nearly destroyed by a system now have his name carved into its walls? It wasn't just victory. It felt like a promise. A vow that no matter how far this fight went, no matter how many people joined it, he wouldn't let it become about fame or awards. It would always be about that young man who once stood alone, scared, and humiliated in front of a judge who thought her power was untouchable. Marcus stood to give his speech. And halfway through, he said something he hadn't planned to. One day, I hope there's no need for people like me to stand here. I hope justice becomes so normal, so natural, that this work feels unnecessary. But until that day, we don't stop. We don't slow down. We don't forget the ones who never got their second chance. Afterward, dozens of leaders approached him with handshakes and invitations. But the one moment that stayed with Marcus came from a quiet woman from South Africa. My brother sat in prison for 20 years, she whispered. A judge just like Whitmore put him there. After seeing your story, we reopened his case. And we brought him home. Marcus didn't know what to say. He just hugged her. Because this was it. This was why it all started. This was why it would never end. That night, as Marcus looked out of his hotel window over the lights of Geneva, he thought of his father's words again. If the door's locked, you find the key. And now? Marcus wasn't just unlocking doors. He was building new ones. Doors wide enough for everyone to walk through. 20 years later. The courtroom felt different now. Not because of the walls. Not because of the chairs or the polished wooden bench. But because of her. Amara Reed straightened her blazer as she stepped up to the podium. 27 years old, sharp as steel, calm as water, and carrying the fire of 1,000 battles she hadn't even lived through, but felt in her blood. She glanced up at the plaque above the door before entering that morning. Marcus Reed Justice Center. Her father was sitting quietly in the back row now. His hair streaked with gray, his hands folded in his lap, watching the daughter who used to sit on his knee asking, "Daddy, why do people treat others like that?" And now here she was, attorney, activist, leader of the Second Gavel Project's next era. Today, Amara wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to defend a boy who reminded her of her father. 17 years old. Accused of stealing something he didn't touch. Arrested because he fit the description. Amara's voice was clear and unwavering as she addressed the court. Your Honor, what we have here is not a case about theft. It's a case about fear. About bias. About the same disease that poisoned this very room decades ago. But today, we are the cure. The judge listened. The jury listened. Because when Amara spoke, it wasn't just her voice. It was her father's. It was every person the Second Gavel Project had ever saved. It was the weight of history colliding with the power of change. And when the verdict came back not guilty, the boy's mother cried so hard, Amara had to hold her up. Later that night, on the steps of the courthouse, Marcus stood beside his daughter, looking out over a small crowd that had gathered to cheer her on. You're better than I ever was, Marcus said quietly. Amara smiled. No. I just picked up where you left off. Marcus looked up at the stars, the same ones he'd stared at all those nights wondering if any of this would ever matter. And now, here was proof that it had. That it still did. You know, Amara said, looking toward the old bench where Judge Whitmore once sat, now just another empty seat, I used to think justice was about winning cases. And now? Marcus asked. Now I know it's about keeping the door open for the next person who needs it. Marcus nodded. That's exactly it. And together, father and daughter stood beneath the night sky, knowing that the gavel might fall. But the fight? The fight would never stop. And neither would they. 5 years later. The world was watching again. This time, the stage wasn't a courtroom. It was a massive arena in Johannesburg, packed with tens of thousands of people from all over the world. Civil rights leaders. Former political prisoners. Journalists. Everyday people who knew what injustice felt like and had finally decided they weren't afraid of it anymore. At the center of it all was Amara Reed, standing beneath towering screens that flashed images of the movement her father started. The faces of the people they had freed. The broken systems they had forced into the light. Behind the scenes, Marcus watched with pride, though his hands trembled. Not from fear. From awe. This wasn't just a family mission anymore. It was global. And it was Amara who had made that happen. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice carrying across the stadium and through millions of live streams around the world. "We are no longer asking," she began. "We are no longer knocking on the doors of the powerful, hoping they'll invite us in. We are building new doors. New systems. New ways of living where fairness isn't optional, it's the foundation." The crowd roared. My father taught me that justice is not a moment. It's not a headline. It's not one courtroom or one trial. It's a fight we carry in our bones. And today, I'm here to tell you, the fight has only just begun. That night, the Second Gavel Project officially announced its expansion into 30 countries. They launched programs to review wrongful convictions, retrain judges, and build schools where young people were taught their rights before the world had a chance to take them away. And as the cameras cut off and the arena lights dimmed, Marcus found Amara standing alone on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. "You've done it," Marcus said softly. She shook her head. "No, we're doing it." Marcus stepped beside her. "When I was your age, I thought if we just fixed one courtroom, that would be enough." "And now?" she asked. Marcus looked out over the horizon, where the world was finally starting to feel wide open. "Now I know we were never meant to fix one room," he said. "We were meant to rebuild the whole damn house." Amara smiled. "Good thing we're just getting started." And together, under the South African sky, with history behind them and the future wide open in front of them, they made a silent promise. As long as there were walls to tear down, systems to rebuild, and people to protect, they would never, ever put down the gavel. 30 years later. The old courthouse was quieter now. The same courthouse where Marcus Reed's life had almost been destroyed and then rebuilt into something the entire world would remember. Inside, a small, private ceremony was being held. Marcus sat in the front row, older now, his hair silver, his hands resting on a cane. Amara stood beside him, her presence still as commanding as ever, though time had placed gentle lines at the corners of her eyes. But today wasn't about either of them. It was about Zion. Marcus's grandson. Amara's son. At just 23 years old, Zion was already making headlines. Not for fame, not for money, but because he was unearthing injustices no one else dared touch. His focus had turned to the prison systems, places designed to bury people alive, people who looked just like him. And today, Zion was being sworn in as the youngest Supreme Court justice the country had ever seen. As he stood before the crowd, his robe crisp and new, Zion glanced back at his mother and grandfather. 3 generations. One fight. Endless courage. When it was his turn to speak, the room fell into complete silence. "My grandfather once told my mother," Zion began, his voice steady, deep, and full of something ancient, "that when the doors are locked against you, you don't just knock. You find the key, or you break them down. He smiled toward Marcus, whose eyes glistened. But today, I stand here to promise you, we are done breaking down doors. From this day forward, we are building gates that never close. Courts that never forget who they serve. Systems that protect rather than punish. And the work doesn't stop with me. It won't stop with my children. Or theirs. Because this. Zion placed his hand over his heart. This is forever. The crowd erupted into applause, but Marcus barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on his grandson, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. As the ceremony ended, Amara helped Marcus to his feet. You see, Dad, she whispered, emotion thick in her voice. You didn't just change the system. You changed the bloodline. Marcus smiled softly. We all did. And as they left the courthouse, now renamed the Reed Center for Justice, the three of them walked side by side. One man who started the fight. One woman who carried it forward. And one young man ready to take it places they'd only dreamed of. And somewhere, deep in the quiet, you could almost still hear it. The gavel falling. Not as an end. But as a beginning. Forever. Years later, Marcus Reed's chair sat empty. The man who had once stood alone in a courtroom, humiliated and powerless, had left behind more than a name carved into buildings. He left a movement. A legacy. A world that looked nothing like the one that tried to break him. At his memorial, people gathered from every corner of the earth. Judges. Activists. Former prisoners who had been freed because of his work. Families who had been given second chances. Presidents. School children. Strangers who only knew his name because somewhere along the line, his fight had saved someone they loved. And at the front stood Amara, delivering the words her father had once given to the world. Justice is not a moment. It's not a trial or a headline. It's something we carry. Something we pass on. She paused, looking toward Zion, now a man fully in his purpose, standing with his hand on her shoulder. And today, we pass it on again. As the crowd bowed their heads, Zion stepped forward. There will never be another Marcus Reed, Zion said, his voice steady, filled with the weight of generations. But there doesn't need to be. Because what he built lives in all of us now. And from that day forward, the Second Gavel Project became something even bigger. No longer just a legal foundation. No longer just a movement. It became a promise. That as long as there were people willing to stand up, willing to speak out, willing to take that gavel in their hands and slam it down for what's right, Marcus Reed's fight would never end. And neither would justice. Not now. Not ever.